Now then, let's begin to look at a series of brainstem sections, and we're going to do this twice. The first point we're going to make about the brainstem sections in order will be to identify some of their sectional characteristics, because as we indicated earlier, it's not unlikely that exam questions will show diagrams or even histologic sections of the brainstem. And the point here is you don't need to know a lot of detail, but you certainly need to be able to recognize whether you are looking at a midbrain section, a pons section, or a medulla section. And knowing that, you need to be able to recognize a couple of things. One is, where are our long tracks running? Where are the three fundamental neural system elements running as they course either up or down through the brainstem, basically on their way down or up from the spinal cord? That's one issue. Number two is, depending on the brainstem section, what cranial nerve is exiting from that brainstem section, and what cranial nerve nuclei are associated with that cranial nerve, particularly if they have a funny name or an interesting name, as we'll see. So those are really the two important issues. So the first point we want to make in going through these sections is to locate where our three major neural system components are found. And certainly the three are the corticospinal tract, which is on its way down through the brainstem, providing the upper motor neuron innervation to lower motor neurons and spinal nerves. That's on its way down. But on their way up through the brainstem, and found in every brainstem section, will be the spinal thalamic tract axons, conveying pain and temperature sensations from limbs and trunk, and the fibers of the medial lemniscus, which are conveying the modalities of touch, vibration, and proprioceptive sense, again from limbs and trunk. So we've kind of illustrated the organization of these tracts on this first slide by saying that, first, the corticospinal tract, as it descends through the length of the brainstem, always is going to be found in a ventral and a medial position. And you can see in this particular section, it's running ventrally through the middle part of each cerebral peduncle, as illustrated here. Second, the spinothalamic tract, on its way up through the brainstem, always is taking a lateral course. The point being that, as we illustrated earlier, most of the brainstem syndromes are vascular in origin, and as we'll see, various parts of the brainstem have a different arterial blood supply in the medial territory versus the lateral territory. So having said that, it's virtually impossible or highly unlikely to have a same vascular syndrome that basically lesions both the spinothalamic tract in a lateral position and the corticospinal tract in a medial position. The other point to be made that here is that the spinothalamic tract is on its way up through the lateral part of the brainstem, but it is accompanied by the descending hypothalamic fibers that are on their way down from the hypothalamus through the entire brainstem, on their way to provide a hypothalamic control over preganglionic sympathetic neurons beginning at the T1 segment of the thoracic spinal cord. So those two fibers run together laterally, which means in a lateral brainstem lesion, they are going to be lesioned together. The major fiber component of a long neural system that changes its position, unlike the first two, is the medial lemniscus. As we've indicated in parentheses here, the medial lemniscus will start out medially in the medulla at its site of formation, but as the medial lemniscus moves through the brainstem, it will begin to move laterally, the reason being that the medial lemniscus has to catch up with the laterally positioned spinothalamic tract, because both the medial lemniscus and the spinothalamic tract are headed for the same thalamic nucleus and therefore have to run together. So the medial lemniscus is going to be the only one of the big three, the only one of our three major long neural systems whose position will change as it goes through the brainstem, starting out medially and then moving laterally. So that's our first task, to recognize where these fiber tracts are running as they go through the brainstem. But before we do that, certainly you need to recognize in a brainstem section that these tracts are going to be found not only in every section, but what are some of the other characteristics which will tell you that in this example, for example, you're looking at an upper midbrain section. So as we said earlier, all midbrain sections have to have either a section through the superior colliculi or the inferior colliculi on the dorsal surface. And only a midbrain section will also contain the cerebral aqueduct, which is situated just below the colliculi and surrounded by the periaqueductal gray. And a third, the other characteristic feature which we illustrated earlier of a midbrain section is the pair of prominent cerebral peduncles separated by the interpeduncular fossa. Now, let's move down to the lower midbrain. It's the next section. And by lower midbrain, still, we're looking at a classic midbrain section because now we have not the superior colliculi, but the inferior colliculi. But again, you can recognize this easily as being a midbrain section because not only of the presence of the colliculi, but also marked by the presence of the cerebral aqueduct. Now, in this particular slide, again, note that the corticospinal tract will again occupy a ventral and medial position, as you see here. And note that since we're at midbrain levels, the medial lemniscus has moved laterally, so it's almost continuous with the myelinated axons of a spinothalamic tract, which, as we know, are being accompanied by the descending hypothalamic fibers. So those two fiber bundles basically are in a dorsal and a lateral position in a lower midbrain section. Now, when we move to Pons sections, as we indicated earlier, all Pons sections are going to be overlain by various parts of the cerebellum and separated from the cerebellum by a fairly large fourth ventricle. So whenever we see the fourth ventricle, we know that below that must be either one part of the pons or basically a section through the rostral medulla, but there's going to be an easy way to distinguish a rostral medulla section from a pons section. So typical of pons sections will be the fourth ventricle, and in addition, the ventral aspect of the pons will have a dramatic ventral bulge formed by what are known as the pontine nuclei. But again, we see the similar position of the corticospinal tract running ventrally and medially through the pons. And again, up in its lateral position, up in the middle pons, we see that the medial lemniscus is still closely associated with the spinothalamic tract and the descending hypothalamic fibers. Note also, in this particular section, we see the fibers of another fiber bundle that runs the length of the brainstem, and this is known as the medial longitudinal fasciculus. These fibers are particularly prominent and increase in number between the abducens nucleus and the lower pons and the oculomotor nucleus in the rostral midbrain, because the fibers of the MLF, as we'll see, are helping to link gaze centers in the brainstem with the abducens and oculomotor neurons to allow us to perform conjugate horizontal gaze voluntarily. Now let's move to a lower pons section, again having characteristics of a pons section, fourth ventricle overlain by the cerebellum. But now we're very close to the pontomedullary junction, and as we'll see when we go through these slides again, we're in the territories of cranial nerves 6 and 7. But more to the point, what we see again are the fibers of the corticospinal tract are still in their ventral and medial position, but now we're starting to see a separation. The medial lemniscus is become separated. It's occupying a more medial position than the more laterally placed fibers of the spinothalamic tract and the descending hypothalamic fibers. Now let's move to an open or an upper medulla section. By open medulla, we mean that this is a rostral medulla section that is again overlain by the fourth ventricle. We don't have in the picture the corresponding area of the cerebellum, which is also going to be present. But the point is, we're looking at a brainstem section that is also overlain by the fourth ventricle, and the issue is, how do we know it's a rostral medulla section? Well, we don't really do it justice on this diagram, but rostral medulla sections are characterized by a very large ventrolateral bulge that forms an olive. And inside that ventrolateral bulge that's known as the olive is the inferior olivary nucleus. And basically, it's a very large diagnostic anatomic feature that instantly allows you to identify a section as being in the upper and rostral medulla. But now again, since we're in this level, we see as we've seen all along, the corticospinal or pyramidal tract in its ventral and medial position. But now note how that the medial lemniscus is also immediately adjacent to the midline portion of the medulla and is certainly distinctly separated from the always laterally positioned fibers of the spinothalamic tract and the descending hypothalamic fibers. So clearly in a rostral medulla section, we can certainly say that the corticospinal tract and the medial lemniscus are going to share a common blood supply because they're in a medial position, whereas the spinothalamic tract and the descending hypothalamic fibers are certainly going to be in a lateral position. Finally, let's look now at a closed or lower medulla section, closed over because a lower medulla section contains the superior part of the central canal, which will extend through the spinal cord. And the closed medulla is very important, as we say on the slide, not so much because of cranial nerve structures that are found there, but the lower medulla, closed medulla section, is the area where 2 of our 3 neural systems have axons that cross the midline. And first off, you can see in the closed medulla section the location of the 2 dorsal column nuclei that we identified on a gross brain picture earlier. The more medially placed nucleus gracilis and the more laterally located nucleus cuneatus. Note that following the rule, the axons of neurons in those nuclei cross in the vicinity of their cell body, and as they cross, they form the so-called internal arcuate fibers, and once they cross over, they will form the medially positioned medial lemniscus. So that's a sensory decussation. And then again, ventrally, we see an illustration of the fibers that are crossing out of each corticospinal or medullary pyramid, and those fibers are also crossing, and once they cross, they will take up a position in the lateral part of the spinal cord white matter and descend down on the contralateral side. So this crossing point is very important because, as we note in the text at the top of the slide, when you lesion the corticospinal tract, the medial lemniscus, and the spinothalamic tract, since it's already crossed, in any brainstem section above this point, the signs and symptoms in the limbs, trunk, and body will be contralateral and below the lesioned neural structure. So the only other point that we need to make is, because the descending hypothalamic fibers run with the spinothalamic tract in a lateral position, a lateral brainstem lesion will affect those spinothalamic fibers, giving us a contralateral loss of pain and temperature in the limbs and trunk. But also, that same patient is likely to have an ipsilateral central Horner syndrome because of the disruption of the sympathetic control of preganglionic sympathetic neurons beginning at the T1 spinal cord level. All right. Now, the next thing we want to do is go back through these same sections and document a little more fully where the cranial nerve exit point is, now that we've illustrated what a typical brainstem section looks like and where the long neural systems are, and see if there are any funny named cranial nerve nuclei that we need to pay attention to functionally because of their association with one or more cranial nerves. And we could start again with an upper midbrain section. In the area where the superior colliculi are where we see the neurons associated with cranial nerves, with cranial nerve 3. So certainly the oculomotor nucleus will provide the lower motor neurons that innervate 4 of the skeletal muscles that move the eyeball, along with the levator palpebrae superioris. But note, this is the first of our funny named cranial nerve nuclei. This is the nucleus of Edinger-Westphal, situated immediately adjacent to the oculomotor nucleus. Remember that Edinger-Westphal contains preganglionic parasympathetic axons that exit the midbrain with cranial nerve 3. So certainly their function, ultimately, will be to participate in a neural pathway that mediates pupillary constriction and accommodation. So note also in the midbrain section is the red nucleus, a source of an additional source of axons of upper motor neurons, as well as the substantia nigra, a major basal ganglia structure that will be discussed subsequently. Next, when we move down to the lower midbrain, we are now in the area where the trochlear nuclei are found. They are again situated medially, as are as were the oculomotor nuclei. But again, note the difference. We can see the axons of each trochlear nerve arising from a trochlear nucleus, but they're going to cross in the velum just behind the inferior colliculus, and exit out from a dorsal position behind the corresponding inferior colliculi. So nothing special about any nuclei associated with cranial nerve 4. Their lower motor neurons are arising contralaterally from a corresponding trochlear nucleus. Then, when we move down to the upper pons, this is the entry or exit point of cranial nerve 5. And the point we want to make here is that right at the entry or exit point of cranial nerve 5 are two trigeminal nuclei. One of them is the main chief or principal sensory nucleus of 5. Those neurons in that nucleus are just responding to touch modalities from the various territories served by sensory fibers of cranial nerve 5. Immediately adjacent and just medial to that main sensory nucleus of 5 are the lower motor neurons of the trigeminal nerve that will exit with the trigeminal nerve from the middle to rostral pons, and as we've discussed, innervate muscles of mastication. Next, when we move down to the lower pons, as we know from the gross view of the brainstem, this is the territory of the entry or exit point of cranial nerves 6, 7, and 8. And again, we don't really have to worry about any of the cranial nerves down here because the nuclei don't have funny names. They're simply named for the nerve that they're associated with. So we have a facial motor nucleus, which is serving muscles of facial expression. The abducens nucleus is certainly the location of lower motor neurons that are associated with the lateral rectus muscle. One other point that's important about the facial nerve and the abducens nucleus. Note the course taken by facial nerve fibers as they arise from their lower motor neurons in the facial nucleus. They do not simply course in a straightforward fashion to exit from the ventrolateral aspect of the pons. In contrast, they sweep over top of the abducens nucleus, forming what's known as an internal genu of the facial nerve, before exiting from their ventrolateral position. The point being that we might have a condition where a patient might develop a lesion of the abducens nucleus, and that same lesion will also affect the fibers of a corresponding facial nerve. But note that the actual fibers of the abducens nerve are exiting, as we said, since it's a purely motor cranial nerve closest to the ventrolateral midline. And although not shown here, the entry point of fibers of the eighth nerve will also be in the same level of the lower pons, but the entering fibers of the facial nerve will be lateral to the entering or exiting fibers of the facial nerve. Last, note that there are two other nuclei worthy of note that are found in a lower pons section. One of them is the superior olivary nucleus, not to be confused with the inferior olivary nucleus, which was a diagnostic landmark of the medulla. The superior olivary nucleus is an auditory structure, which is going to be the first site where sound localization is being processed, because the superior olivary neurons are being bilaterally innervated by axons from both cochlear nuclei. And last but not least, even though we are down in the area of cranial nerves 6, 7, and 8, note that there is also a trigeminal structure that's found here, which will also be present in the two sections below this. And this is the spinal tract and spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The function of these two structures is to respond to just pain and temperature sensations from the various territories innervated by the trigeminal nerve. So we need to be sensitive about the fact that this trigeminal nerve structure is found throughout the entire length of the lower brainstem, beginning just below the entry or exit point of the trigeminal nerve, which we saw in the upper pons. Now, let's move down to our upper medulla section again. And we know it's an upper medulla section because of the presence of the olive and the underlying inferior olivary nucleus, which is not an auditory structure, but a cerebellar structure. And as we know, this is the entry or exit point of cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12. And note that the olive serves as a point of separation between the entering and exiting fibers of those three cranial nerves. Note that cranial nerve 12, being purely motor, is exiting from the upper medulla between the pyramid, the corticospinal tract, and the olive, whereas cranial nerves 9 and 10 are exiting or entering on the other side in a position that's more dorsolateral to that corresponding olive. So in addition to having 9, 10, and 12 down here, there are some additional cranial nerve nuclei worthy of note. Certainly the hypoglossal nucleus is straightforward. It contains the lower motor neurons of the hypoglossal nerve that are serving tongue muscles. But adjacent to that is a dorsal motor nucleus of 10 that is the home of preganglionic parasympathetic neurons that are exiting in the vagus nerve. Then, two named nuclei whose names do not give you a clue as to what they do. One of them is the solitary nucleus, illustrated up here in the lateral part of the open medulla section. The solitary nucleus is purely sensory and is responding to various visceral sensations. All of the visceral sensations associated with touch, carried into it by cranial nerves 7 and 9. The solitary nucleus is also responding to input from the carotid sinus and the carotid body, and enabling it to help us self-regulate changes in response to blood pressure and the chemical content of blood. So that's a visceral sensory nucleus that obviously has a lot of visceral sensations associated with it. Lastly is the nucleus ambiguus. The nucleus ambiguus is named for its difficulty in being able to identify it, but note that it's located again in the lateral part of the medulla. It's the home of lower motor neurons of cranial nerves 9 and 10, so its function, therefore, is to provide a motor innervation to most of the muscles of the soft palate, the pharynx, and the larynx, respectively. And again, also note that even though we're down in a medulla section, in the area of territory of cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12, again, we have to be cognizant of the presence of the spinal tract and nucleus of 5, which we said earlier in the previous section are responding to pain and temperature sensations, just pain and temperature sensations, carried in from various territories of the trigeminal nerve. And then finally, down in this upper medulla section is the most prevalent area to identify the cochlear nuclei and the vestibular nuclei, because we're relatively close at this point to the pontomedullary junction, which is the entry point, as you see here, of the fibers of the vestibular cochlear nerve. And then, as we've already illustrated, the closed medulla section in the next view was the site where we had two of our neural systems axons crossing the midline. And it's not really so much a cranial nerve territory, except for the fact that, again, we see the location of the spinal tract of 5 and the spinal nucleus of 5, that are pain and temperature receptive structures associated with the trigeminal nerve.